In 2024, a sci-fi psychological thriller television series has arrived. After narrowly escaping death from the International Space Station, astronaut Joe returns to Earth only to find that familiar people and things have undergone eerie changes. Driving with her daughter Alice on a remote countryside road, the radio repeats hoarse whispers. Joe pretends to reassure Alice that everything is normal as they arrive at a small cabin in the forest. After packing their belongings, Joe quickly hides a backpack containing metal cans. Suddenly, Alice's voice is heard from a distance, even though Alice is clearly sleeping in the room. Joe seems to realize something and resolutely walks towards the sound. 5 weeks earlier, when Joe was still aboard the International Space Station, through a video call, she tells Alice that she will soon return to Earth. Today, they will embark on a special mission, to experiment with a newly discovered substance that can only remain active in zero gravity. Just as everything is ready, the commander has just started the experimental equipment when a loud noise echoes through the space station. Immediately, the pressure drops sharply, and an iron rod flies in, piercing the commander's arm directly. The ground command center issues an emergency notice. There's a sudden malfunction on the space station, ordering all astronauts to enter Escape Pod 1 and execute the emergency evacuation procedure. At this moment, Joe's compartment has returned to normal. She sees a colleague trapped by a fire in the corridor. Quickly grabbing a fire extinguisher, she clears a path and successfully leads the colleague to escape. After closing the hatch to the burning compartment, they begin to take a head count. The situation of the commander is the most critical, as he has fallen into unconsciousness due to his severed arm. Joe assumes the role of acting commander. She and the doctor stay behind to administer emergency treatment to the commander, while the others go to inspect the damage inside the space station. One piece of bad news after another floods in. The power and life support systems of the space station are damaged. Escape Pod 1's power system is malfunctioning, while Escape Pod 2 is available but only has 3 seats. Inside the ground command center, Henry, the project leader, sees the experimental data just before the accident and can't help but sigh in amazement. He then issues a bewildering command: regardless of the circumstances, the astronauts must repair the space station and continue the experiment. Joe, upon receiving the order, reluctantly puts on her spacesuit and heads into outer space to perform repairs. When she arrives at the damaged section of the space station, she discovers that the power supply system has suffered a severe impact, with all external cables destroyed. Without the proper equipment, she cannot reconnect the cables. Upon learning of this outcome, the ground commander immediately orders all astronauts to return to Earth, completely ignoring Henry's strong protests. At that moment, the sun happens to pass over the horizon, illuminating the location of the space station. Joe, using the light, unexpectedly discovers a 50-centimeter crack in the station's hull. As Joe approaches to inspect, she moves aside a cable and is met with a terrifying sight: the face of a person. The impact object turns out to be the body of an astronaut. Startled, Joe loses her balance, and if it weren't for the safety tether, she might have drifted off into space herself. After finally returning to the compartment, Joe receives yet another unfortunate piece of news: the commander has passed away due to excessive bleeding. Now there are only 4 astronauts left, but the escape pod can only accommodate 3. Everyone looks at each other, clearly reluctant to stay behind. In the end, Joe makes the decision to stay behind and repair the other escape pod, while the other 3 return to Earth. The command center immediately approves this plan because the space station's life support system can only sustain 1 person for 19 hours. After the 3 teammates enter the escape pod and initiate the separation procedure, Joe watches them drift away, feeling deeply saddened. She longs to reunite with her family. At this moment, Alice and Joe's husband, Magnus, have already boarded a special plane bound for the command center, accompanied by the former commander's daughter. Their greatest wish is to see their loved ones returning to Earth as soon as possible, and Joe is making every effort to make that happen. The escape pod's power system was damaged in the accident and requires all batteries to be replaced. As time ticks by, the command center finally receives good news: the escape pod carrying the 3 astronauts has successfully entered the atmosphere and landed safely, with no injuries. Meanwhile, Joe, instead of continuing the power repair work, retrieves a bracelet necklace that her daughter gave her. She can part with anything except for this necklace. During the repair process, Joe receives a new task from the command center, requiring her to retrieve the new substance and experimental apparatus from the experimental compartment. It turns out that Henry had previously requested the escape pod to bring back the items to Earth, but the instruction was intercepted by Irina, the person in charge of the ground command center, who believed that the accident was likely related to the experiment with the new substance. Henry is furious, his lips trembling as he berates Irina for not understanding the significant importance of the experiment, which could change the entire world. Irina, feeling uncertain, reluctantly issues the retrieval order to Joe. However, Joe doesn't immediately agree because she can't guarantee that she'll have time to go to the laboratory after replacing the batteries. Just then, Magnus and Alice finally arrive at the command center. Just as they are about to communicate, the communication signal suddenly cuts off. Joe is very anxious, watching as the emergency lights start to go out one by one, indicating that the power is running out. She has to set aside distractions and speed up the repair process. Suddenly, a sound breaks the silence in the compartment, prompting Joe to follow its source. As she arrives at the laboratory, the surroundings suddenly change, and Joe finds herself inside a building. Curious, she explores ahead until she reaches the end of a corridor, where she sees the necklace her daughter gave her. When she turns back, the surroundings revert to the appearance of the space station. Alice's call brings Joe back to reality and she continues toward the source of the sound. Before long, she arrives at a wooden cabin and curiously surveys her surroundings. Time seems to stand still here. Astonished, Joe pushes open the door and finds that the furnishings inside are identical to those in her own cabin. When she reaches the end of the corridor again, she sees Alice's necklace once more. Upon opening the door, she is surprised to find another Alice inside. Without time to think, she immediately picks up Alice and heads toward her own cabin. Alice is mentally and physically drained from the extreme cold, and Joe hurriedly lights a fire and heats water, needing to warm Alice up quickly. But as she puts Alice into the bathtub, Joe suddenly remembers that there's another Alice lying in the room. She looks back and forth between them, completely puzzled as to why there were two Alice. When she enters the bathroom again, the Alice in the bathtub has disappeared. Meanwhile, the Alice sleeping in the room is awakened by the calling, and Joe approaches and sniffs her, realizing that the girl in front of her is not her own Alice. Suddenly, the surroundings change again, and Joe wakes up in the space station. She checks the time and realizes that she has been unconscious for several hours, likely due to low blood oxygen levels. With time running out, Joe has to accelerate the repair process. A piece of white cloth floats slowly towards her. She quickly shines her flashlight on it, only to find that the commander's body, at some unknown point, had opened its eyes. Joe's heart races, but she gathers the courage to close his eyes and cover his head with the white cloth once more. The environment around her is eerily quiet, so Joe decides to record her voice to dispel her fear. She hears hoarse voices coming from outside the compartment. However, when she stops recording, the voice suddenly disappears too. Joe plays back the previous recording and indeed hears a hoarse male voice mixed in. She then turns on her flashlight and checks again. She saw a floating arm through the window. Opening the hatch, she discovers it's the commander's severed arm. Joe couldn't tell if this was a paranormal event or just hallucinations due to lack of oxygen. She could only focus her attention on replacing the batteries. When there were only 90 minutes left, the power of the escape pod finally restored. Joe was about to initiate the separation procedure when she realized that due to the communication interruption, the escape pod hadn't received the latest return orbit parameters. She could only rely on the parameters used by another escape pod, combined with time, and amazingly, she simulated the latest orbit parameters manually. Seeing that she still had enough time, Joe went to the laboratory to retrieve the new substance and experimental apparatus. After inputting the orbit parameters, Joe recorded everything she wanted to say to her daughter into the tablet. The success of her return now rested solely on fate. After closing the hatch, she hesitated no further and initiated the detachment procedure. However, the system suddenly lit up with warning lights. Consulting the manual, Joe learned it was a bolt system malfunction, which required 2 people for manual troubleshooting. She felt chills down her spine. Was she really going to die here? But in the next moment, the malfunction miraculously resolved itself. As the escape pod slowly departed from the space station, Joe stared in disbelief because she saw a figure standing in the main compartment as it drifted away.